He is famous the world over as, quote, Putin's brain. His books have been banned by the Biden administration in the United States.
Aleksandr Dugin, whom some have called, quote, the most dangerous philosopher in the world.
Aleksandr Dugin, hello.
Hello.
What is the Russian world? Is it a founding myth, an ideology, or a historical reality?
It is all of these at once. We can say it is a myth, we can say it is a worldview or an ideology, and we can say it is a historical reality. The Russian world is the borders of Russian civilization, which is by definition inclusive, meaning it contains a great variety of different societies. That is to say, it is an inclusive Russian civilization, which primarily includes the Eastern Slavs. In other words, we are talking about the Russian world, which contains the Little Russians and the Belarusians. Because when we identified only the Great Russians with the Russians, the Muscovites, we limit the concept of Russian, because Belarusians considered themselves Russian. Back then, there were no Belarusians, but inhabitants of Belarus, the inhabitants of southwestern Russia, where Ukraine is now. So, there are at least 3 branches, although there are also other distinct Rus, with complex processes that took place in this Russian world. But in any case, these are the Eastern Slavs, the exact definition of the Russian world, and the core of the Russian world. That's why it's called Russian. But at the same time, since it is an inclusive reality, an inclusive civilization, which integrates other ethnic and cultural groups, as this Russian world expanded, and it has been a long time, since the very beginning, since Kievan Rus, other non-Slavic peoples of all kinds, Circassians, North Caucasians, Turks, Finno-Ugrians, they became, from the earliest stages of the formation of the Russian state, an integral parts of this Russian world. The Finno-Ugric tribes, along with the Eastern Slavic tribes, invited Rurik. Our chronicle begins when the Finno-Ugrians and Eastern Slavs invited the Germans. Maybe with Varangians too. Perhaps among the genealogy of these Varangians, there were also ethnic elements from Western Russia, but that's another story. Currently, it's the Norman theory that is debated. That is to say, from the very beginning, the Russian world was formed inclusively. In other words, these were the Eastern Slavs who attracted more and more other peoples and other ethnic groups into their zone of historical existence. And gradually, the expansion of this Russian world reached at certain times such proportions that it included both Poland and Finland and vast territories to the east and south. At certain periods, this Russian world contracted. That's what distinguishes the Russian world, for example, from the state and the history of the state. Because the history of the state is always a question of borders. They can contract or expand. But the Russian world is a sort of civilizational constant. It has its maximum extents, and it also has its minimum extents. But overall, even when the state, for example, contracts, and the borders of the state are reduced, like in 1991 or in 1917, we see that history tends each time towards a new integration or recomposition of the Russian world. That's why we have a very subtle difference here. The Russian world is the Russian civilization, in contrast with the Russian state. So the Russian state is in constant change, but the territory and border of the Russian world either expand or remain unchanged. That's why it's very important. Because if we understand that the Russian world is a civilizational concept and not a state concept, we can then imagine a very diverse configuration of borders within this Russian world. For example, sovereign Belarus. It is sovereign because it is friendly towards the Russian world. Contemporary Belarus considers itself as a sovereign and independent state and not at all a part of the Russian Federation, but it is indisputably part of the Russian world. In other words, that's the Russian world, but at the same time, it retains its sovereignty. We can also imagine in the Russian world, for example, entire sovereign systems that are more or less independent and autonomous within it, but they are still part of the Russian world. And even Ukraine, which rebels against the Russian world, is also part of the Russian world, because it shares with us a history, a territory, a civilization, and a religion. Yes, now there is a complete denial of its roots, its identity, through the artificial creation of a Nazi nationalist identity. But that does not change the underlying parameter. Anyway, Ukraine is part of the Russian world, just like Belarus. But regarding the myth, in general, history is guided by myths, not by scientific discoveries. Thanks to scientific discoveries, technology and techniques are developing. But as soon as technology enters the public space, it also becomes a myth. The myth of progress, the myth of a happy future, or conversely, the myth of man-made disasters, presented as irreparable. Humanity reasons through myths because it's easier, and in this sense, one can say that contemporary Russia is increasingly imbued with this myth of the Russian world. At the same time, one can say that it is becoming a worldview, and the President Putin talks more and more about the Russian world and what the head of state says, especially in Russia, a country that has great respect for the leader and holds him in high regard. It acquires an additional meaning. In fact, the Russian world today is becoming a political worldview and even the political ideology of our society. Since we are returning to our roots, we are paying more and more attention to our identity. And in principle, talking about the civilization state, here's another term that our president uses, including in his decrees 334 on historical influence, where this term of civilization state is highlighted. We can therefore say that Russia as a civilization state is the Russian world. That is to say, it is not the Russian Federation. It is much wider, so it can become and has become or is becoming a political ideology as a worldview. And at the same time, history shows us the maximum and minimum scale of this Russian world. In the broad sense, it includes Poland, Finland, and the entire territory of the Russian Empire. And maybe even, for example, Serbia can be included, or under certain circumstances, and also the countries of the Warsaw Pact. Under a special status, Mongolia can enter, for example. That is to say, generally speaking, the borders of the Russian world are not yet entirely defined, and at the peak of its renaissance, it includes many countries and peoples.
But it also means that it is also a geopolitical doctrine, and it frightens the West. If we assume that where there are Russians, there is the Russian world, it means that it is also Kazakhstan, and in the Baltics, and so on.
Even Kazakhs can, under certain circumstances, be part of the Russian world. Not only where there are Russians, but where Russia is present as a civilization. There is also another term similar to the Russian world, which is Eurasia.
But what about the transition from the Russian world to Eurasia? Because there is a Turkic world, a Chinese world, an Indian world, an Arab world. They are different, even if they share common things. So how can one move from the Russian world to Eurasia and integrate very distant civilizations like China and India?
Eurasia is an almost synonymous term with the term Russian world. The concept of Eurasia for the Eurasians is not a geographical concept, but a civilizational concept. In fact, the Eurasians, the founders of the Eurasian path, they use this term, Russia, Eurasia. It precisely designates that Russia, in its most inclusive form, includes other peoples. In essence, the Russian world, Russia and Eurasia are one. By the term Eurasia, the Eurasians meant only the northeastern part of Eurasia. Everything beyond is excluded. Chinese civilization, Indian civilization, Iranian civilization, Turkish civilization. That is to say, these civilizations located south of the ridge of the Eurasian mountains. If we take just the example from Manchuria to the Carpathians, one can imagine and see that there is a chain of mountains, the Carpathians, and on the other side of the Black Sea, it's the Caucasus. Further starts the Tian Shan and the Himalayas. Manchuria is there. We cross practically all of Eurasia, and we see this mountain range. And what is north of this range is Eurasia, and what is south are other civilizations, Chinese, Indian, Iranian, Turkish. These are historical constants, but these are civilizational constants because the borders of the state can change. They can move south, north, experience collapses in some places. But if we talk about what Trubetskoy and Savitsky, the founders of Eurasianism, called the emergence or development environment, this is a concept that cannot be translated. In other words, we can say that it is a geopolitical horizon of a civilization, where a civilization reigns and dominates. There, it's not just a place, but where culture develops, and where ethnogenesis, or the surrounding landscape, takes place, as Lev Nikolaevich Gumilev, another Eurasian, called it. That is to say, we are talking about the fact that by Eurasia, we must specifically understand the northeast Eurasia, which is located north of the Eurasian mountain range. And the western border is in constant clarification. Well, let's say for certain, up to the Carpathians, up to the Baltic. But where exactly does this border of the Eurasian zone lie? Because even Hungary, they are Eurasian nomads who came to a territory that in general was a continuation of the Eurasian steppe. It was the extension of the Turan. That is why, for example, one of the most important parts of their identity is specifically Turanian. The second is European Catholic, but one of the two is Turanian. Therefore, where exactly does the western border of Eurasia end? This is exactly what is defined, including in the clashes and wars with Napoleon, with Hitler, with the Teutonic Knights, with the Poles. We spend our whole lives defining this western border of Eurasia. The southern border is delineated by the mountains, even though with the Turks, there were also several Russo-Turkish wars. The southwest border has also been constantly disputed and redefined. So, when we say Eurasia, we must, of course, not include China, India, Iran, and Turkey. But they can build their relations with Russia-Eurasia on their own, which in general, from their own interests. And there are many commonalities, whether in economics, or history, or in energy, or in culture, or from the point of view of origin. These same Turks came from this Turan. They came to Anatolia and the Balkans from Eurasia, more specifically, from northern Eurasia. With the Iranians, we share common ancient historical roots, because the Iranian is divided into nomads and settlers. And the settlers have settled in the south.
Are we talking about the Indo-Europeans in general?
Yes, the Indo-Europeans, but more specifically, the Iranians. They settled in Iran, in Persia, and their relatives remained as nomadic Persian-speaking peoples in the territory of Eurasia, the Sarmatians, Scythians. Similarly, for the Vedic Aryans, they also came to the territory of Hindustan from the territory of Eurasia. That is to say, this territory of Eurasia can unite, and China, at the time, for example, of the Tang dynasty, effectively extended its power over Central Asia, over the Turkish peoples, and in general, over the Eurasian nomads. That is why we have many overlaps and many common points. But nonetheless, strictly speaking, under the term Eurasia, the Eurasians, and we understand in the narrow sense that it is the territory of the Russian world, with these peoples, the territories, and the zones that were part of it. The territory of the Turan, not Iran, but the Turan.
Some historians, like Lev Gumilev, consider that Russia is a synthesis or a historical result of the union of the steppe and the forest. Does this aspect constitute one of the characteristics of the Russian world that distinguishes it from the West and the East?
Of course, yes. This theory was developed by George Vernadsky, that of the balance of relations between the steppe and the forest in Russian history, and Gumilev extended it. He too was Eurasian and a successor of the Eurasians. It's a very specific idea that when the Slavs and the Finno-Ugric peoples, when they originally formed, they formed on the territory of rivers, fields, and forests, and the steppe space. It was under the control of the nomadic peoples. Initially, these nomadic peoples were once the same Indo-Europeans, Scythians, Sarmatians, their descendants, the Ossetians. The Ossetians today are the direct descendants of the nomadic peoples. After them appeared the Huns, a people whose ethnic origins are unclear. Were they Mongols or Proto-Turks, or of another origin with Indo-European elements? It's possible and even likely. After that, it was undoubtedly the Turks, then the Mongols. And according to the steppe, in the steppe, there have always been the carriers of another culture, neither sedentary nor farmers. And the first Slavs were certainly farmers and fully sedentary. And the balance and the relationship, the dialectic between the sedentary agricultural Slavic communities and the nomadic steppe armies structured a certain rhythm of Russian history. Sometimes one had the upper hand, sometimes the other. At the time of the Mongol invasions, it was clearly the steppe that had the upper hand. At an earlier time, the competition between the princes of Kiev and the Turkish peoples, with the Pechenegs and the Cumans, it was more or less a balance. The ones and the others repelled each other alternately. In the time of Sviatoslav, a very short period, the Slavs actually subdued a significant area of the steppe territory up to the Taman Peninsula, which was also precisely part of the Russian state. So, between Taman and the Principality of Chernigov, there were direct connections. They were considered a single political entity, even though the steppe was between them, and the control of this steppe rarely belonged to the Slavs. So, in general, this is our whole history. And then we enter the time of Genghis Khan and that of the Golden Horde as vassals of the steppe. That is to say, the steppe defeated the forest, and then, on the contrary, the forest began to counterattack.
You explain that the Mongols saved Orthodox Christianity.
Yes, I agree. It happened exactly like that. Because, of course, the Orthodox, the Russians, those who today are called Little Russians or Belarusians, they also fought against the Catholics to defend their religious identity. They are also heroes. We must not denigrate their exploits. But they lived, of course, under the conditions of a simple dictatorship, that of the Catholics, who tried to destroy and uproot their faith. And during the time of the Golden Horde, the Khan of the Golden Horde, despite the fact that they were Muslims, they did nothing and did not attack the identity. From this point of view, we have entirely preserved our identity, including thanks to the religious policy of the Khans of the Golden Horde, who never introduced on their territories such rigorous forms of Sharia as those found in the Arab world, or in Iran, or in other countries. They were very tolerant and followed the precepts of Genghis Khan, and they belonged to the faith of other peoples. The defeated, even the subordinates, were treated with great respect. They never imposed religion in principle, and then, when the Russian Orthodox became the main power of northern Eurasia, we did the same. We also treated Islam very delicately and with tolerance. Religious conversions were only voluntary, and there was no coercion or humiliation of the rights of Islamic peoples in Christian policy. Although they constitute an important part of our population, that is, Russia paid back in the same coin that the Muslims paid to the Russians during the Golden Horde, that is, to recognize our religious identity.
Can we say that the roots of our state tradition are both Byzantine and Mongol?
That's exactly right. Because we received a double heritage from two empires, the religious aspect and also the legal, the ecclesiastical policy. We received them from Byzantium. In the last period of its existence, the Byzantine Empire consisted of a few Balkan provinces, or part of the Peloponnese. That is, not at all an empire. The scale was not imperial, but the Byzantines were the bearers of Rome. They were the bearers of the most ancient status of the empire, which came to us from them. And in true geopolitics, we received the heritage of the Golden Horde, the empire of Genghis Khan, precisely the Turanian heritage. And thus, really, the Russian Empire is the successor of two traditions at once, Roman Byzantine, and that of Genghis Khan. It is on this that the Eurasian worldview is based regarding this, the heritage of Genghis Khan, the book that was written by Nikolai Sergeyevich Trubetskoy, the founder of the Eurasian movement.
Moscow, Third Rome, Russia as Katechon, and the symphony of powers as a political system, is that also the Russian world?
Yes, unquestionably. That is what gave the Russian world an idea of universal scope. That is, thanks to the Byzantine heritage, the idea of a symphony of powers. The idea of Katechon the Tsar as the executor of the religious, global and universal mission aimed at preventing the coming of the Antichrist. That came to us from Byzantium. And this idea was known before the fall of Byzantium. That is to say, this is how we perceived the Byzantine Empire. But when Byzantium collapsed, and even before, when it abandoned the Orthodox foundations and accepted the Florentine Union, that is, it went to bow to the Pope, renouncing its identity, and after that, it lost its state status under the attacks of the Ottomans. Therefore, during this period, the idea of Moscow Third Rome was formed, that the Third Rome migrated to Moscow, and Moscow is now the heir of Rome, not just of Byzantium, but of Rome, of the entire Roman Empire. And Rome in turn was the heir of the Greek kingdom, and Greece the heir of the Achaemenids, and the Achaemenids are heirs of the Chaldean, Babylonian, Neo-Babylonian kingdom. Therefore, Russia became a world power from the point of view of status after the fall of Byzantium, remaining faithful to orthodoxy and asserting itself not as a grand duchy, but as a kingdom, as an empire. The idea of Moscow Third Rome manifested in various ways at each stage of our history. Recently, I just finished the book that I will soon publish, called Third Rome, 7 Dispensations of the Russian Idea. In other words, the dispensation is, in a way, the historical form of expression of an idea. Through the 7 Dispensatio of the Russian idea, I describe in detail how this concept, theory of Third Rome, is formed long before Moscow, because before that, this status of Third Rome was claimed by the Bulgarians, the Serbs, even the Romanians and Moldovans, for a short period during the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Croats spoke of their election to this title, as strange as it may seem. And in general, Slavophilism did not appear in Russia. In Russia, it appeared later. It was known to the Poles, the Czechs, but the Croats were the first. Therefore, the aggregation of these ideas of Third Rome before Moscow is the first dispensatio. The second dispensatio is when the old monk, Starets, Philotheus of the Pskov monastery, gave it a theoretical form. Then, it was realized through the coronation of Ivan the Terrible. That is the third dispensation, the history of the Moscow kingdom. Later, this idea is found in the legends and myths of the old believers. Then, the Slavophiles will project it on a large scale. There it is, the fifth dispensatio. The Third Rome becomes the main tuning fork of the radiance of Russian culture of the 19th century, through Dostoevsky, through our music, through the opera, by Rimsky-Korsakov. All these ideas of Moscow Third Rome simply become the dominant tuning forks of Russian culture, of Russian philosophy, of Russian aesthetics, and of Russian politics. Because the Russian Tsars, the last Romanovs, paid more and more attention to it. Then the disaster of the Soviet Union, and there, the sixth dispensatio of the Third Rome exiles into theory in the white immigration among the Eurasians and the monarchists, who speak of it already as a dream, a nostalgia, and a phantom pain, but rethink the sacred meaning of imperial power, of the Tsar, which was almost erased on the eve of the revolution. And now, the seventh dispensatio in relation to Putin, in relation to the special military operation in Ukraine. The dispensatio of the idea of Third Rome is today the model that drives our history today. That is what inspires and animates us. Some know it, others guess it, but it is the main formula of the Russian idea.
I actually have a question about it. How contemporary is this idea of Third Rome? And are the Russian elites aware of it today? Not just Putin, but all the elites.
It is absolutely contemporary because it is related to eternity. The idea of Moscow Third Rome is not just a glorification of Russia. It is also the future, but a very tragic future, because in the future, the idea of Moscow Third Rome announces a collision with the Antichrist and the movement towards the end of the world. That is to say, the empire is eternal, it always holds, but at some point it comes to an end. It is eternal in relation to time, but in relation to God, it is instantaneous like the world, meaning the universe is the world. In other words, it is the cosmos. It always exists, as long as there is something of being, but being itself is not eternal. Being is thus eternal in terms of the time of existence, but it is nothing before God. And this dual status of the world, or the universe, is a dual creation. On one hand, they exist as long as there is something, and on the other hand, in the eyes of God, it was created, meaning it did not exist before and will not exist after, which predetermines the tragedy of the imperial vision of the world. There has always been an empire, but in the final era of the world, it will collapse because the world itself will collapse, not because the empire will collapse and the world will remain. With the empire, the world will collapse too. There will be a short period of rule by the Antichrist, the Dajjal for Muslims, and then the end will come. So, to prolong the existence of the universe, it is necessary to protect the empire.
This is the Katechon.
That's exactly the Katechon. And that's the meaning of the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome. And this idea is quite tragic. It is dramatic and eschatological. Then, it is linked to the end of times. So, does our elite understand this idea? I think very weakly, very vaguely. But it doesn't matter, because we are increasingly aware of Russia as a state civilization. This is already a fact. We are beginning more and more to understand the satanic nature of the West and the seriousness and fundamental dimension of this war with the West, and to explain why we find ourselves in this position. Who are we, and with whom are we waging this war? For this, you need the theory of Moscow as the Third Rome. So I think that, in its pure and rigorous form, as we are discussing it now, there are few who understand it today. But intuitively, more and more people are approaching it, including among the ruling elite. And among the people, of course, the communist era, the materialistic age, the liberal era have undermined the foundations of such a worldview. Because from this point of view, the end of the world does not exist. God does not exist. The empire is an obsolete and purely historical institution. And this does not allow to grasp the essence of this teaching. We will simply say that the worldview is not ready, not educated to understand its meaning.
But it still exists at the level of the collective unconscious.
Absolutely true. It exists at the level of the collective unconscious. It exists as a theory to which conservative intellectuals resort, who increasingly turn to it. It also affects the elite, including the political elite. I know at least several representatives at the highest level within the Russian government who know it very well and fully share it, perhaps with some nuances. And that's not nothing, because there are people responsible for strategic planning, implementation of the most important directions of our policy, and who are at the same time aware and committed to the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome, starting with the president. This is already a great achievement.
Last question. In one of your seminars, I heard you say that Ivan the Terrible represents the acme or paroxysmal phase of the Third Rome, because he was very aware of what that means and who the real Antichrist is. Do we need a new Ivan the Terrible with an Oprichnina and so on to definitively rid ourselves of all these liberals, etc.?
That there is a certain parallel between Ivan the Terrible and Stalin. Stalin also transformed the Bolshevik regime, internationalist, Marxist, and materialistic, into something completely different. He got rid of the old guard and the nihilists from the first era. Of course, we need such a figure, and of course, Ivan the Terrible was simply the embodiment of it. In fact, his dispensatio, and with him, it is the third dispensatio in this theory. In relation to him, we have the transformation of theory into practice. But this is an extremely tragic thing. Everyone thinks Ivan the Terrible was a cruel man, and many in connection with the oprichnina gave negative results. Also, it turned out to be not a panacea. But he stood in front of the end of the world. In other words, he took responsibility for the Katechon, and it is an extremely terrible period. It is a period during which you stand alone and are responsible not only for all the people, but for all of humanity and the entire universe, alone before God, with no one to lean on. And you stand there, answering for the destiny of existence, with no one to rely on. You understand that the attention of subjects, who are constantly worried about minor and secondary issues, about betrayal, greed, ambition, competition, hatred, and instead of saving existence from the devil, they attend to their petty affairs.
Exactly like today.
Probably as always, perhaps. But Ivan the Terrible's acute understanding, and I think partly Stalin's at the time, who shoulders the role of a great and universal leader, as befits a ruler of Rus in a specially chosen area of the world, of the universe, tragic and very eschatological, and alarming at the same time. All of this obviously creates enormous tensions, which can be expressed through good reforms, through incorrect reforms, through cruelty, or conversely, through passivity. We had kings who were so paralyzed by this that they couldn't undertake anything. For example, the marvelous Bogomolets, Fyodor Iovanovich, a marvelous Tsar, and even Nicholas II, but also contemplators, mystics. But their will was completely paralyzed by the weight of their mission. That is, in the earthly world, they were simply afraid to handle anything. And when they did, it didn't go very well. But Ivan the Terrible, on the other hand, bore a spiritual consciousness, and at the same time, he delved into the depths of matter, trying to fulfill this mission entrusted to him. Now, perhaps we need this last Tsar, the last Tsar as the quintessence of our history. There are certain characteristics of this in Vladimir Putin. He is unquestionably the savior of Russia. He unquestionably lifted our country out of the abyss, simply out of the abyss. So he has every reason to be the supreme sovereign of our country, to be a monarch, and I am convinced of this. And many emperors of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire were simply identified, simply acclaimed by an enthusiastic mass. I think that's legitimate. He is already legitimate as a leader, but he could also be legitimate as a Tsar. He is already irreplaceable as a leader. But is he this last Tsar or not? This is an open question, because he has done much to bring about this last Tsar. But will he reveal himself, perhaps at the last moment, as such a figure? Or is he the herald of this character, this last Russian monarch? That is the open question. So we live in this eschatological anticipation. Monarchy, it is perhaps the most current thing among the things happening in Russian politics today. Certainly not political parties, nor social movements, nor civil society. These institutions are either controlled by the state, if we talk about parties, or by Western intelligence, which has absolutely nothing to do with Russia's destiny. Therefore, only the highest monarchical power truly possesses sovereignty and freedom to influence in any way our destiny, that of our state and of humanity as a whole. But this responsibility, now weighing on Putin, I think it corresponds to that which weighed on Stalin and Ivan the Terrible, perhaps even more so, because upon his decision depends the existence or disappearance of humanity. We are on the brink of nuclear war, so in principle, a decision will have to be made at some point, and it is unlikely that we can escape it. That is to preserve or not life on Earth. And in such a situation, it is probable that neither Ivan the Terrible nor even Stalin found themselves in such a situation. That is why it is difficult to imagine the inner world of the leader of Russia at such a critical hour of world history, and not just ours.
Aleksandr Dugin, thank you very much.